Here is a rerun of my session from London Salesforce tour on May 19th. The session was entitled Lightning Out Components on Any Platform. This is me, Andy Fawcett. I'm Financial Force CTO, Salesforce MVP, Certified Developer and Advanced Developer. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter and my blog, details are here on the screen. So a little bit about Financial Force before we dive into the session. We are native on the Salesforce App Cloud since 2009. I've had a series of rounds of investment from various investors, including Salesforce themselves, and are currently pushing around 660 plus employees. Our headquarters are in San Francisco, and a number of customers around the globe, around 34 different countries. You can see some of the logos of a selection of our customers here on the screen. So let's get into the agenda of this particular session on Lightning Out. Let's have a bit of a recap about what components and containers and events are, because that pertains to the bulk of the session and the way that the components have been architected in both of the containers we'll be showing. And also serve as a bit of a recap or even a bit of an overview for those of you that are not familiar with components and containers. Address Finder components are some new components I've created. They are kind of my first components that I've created, so I'll be using those in the demos, so we'll get a feeling of how to use components in different containers. Components in Lightning Experience is actually a new feature. Salesforce obviously have been running their components in that Lightning Experience for some time now, but the first time that we can run those components actually on the likes of the home page or even on the record detail pages is new for summer 16. So we'll take a brief look at that and then take a look at Lightning Out, which is a way of taking those same components and putting them elsewhere in other containers outside of Salesforce, such as Google Apps. That's the main demo of this particular session. We'll have some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way about Google Apps scripts, things like OAuth, how to log into Salesforce and how to use Lightning Out in that environment, and generally some more information on resources and Q&A. So an overview of Lightning components. Components are kind of like the Lego bricks of the UI. They're there to deliver a finely crafted default UI, if that's so what you want to deliver to your users, or allow those users to deconstruct those UIs and put them back together in a way that's pleasing or useful to them. And Lightning App Builder is the main tool in which they can do that from a kind of clicks not code perspective. Obviously, if you're a developer, you could develop more complex solutions. Every component really needs a container to exist. Whether it's that obvious or not, there will be some kind of concept or physical manifestation of a container. Its general responsibility is to load the components, ask each component to render itself, and manage events. A component itself has the responsibility, broadly speaking, of rendering its UI, showing the data, interacting with the user in the space that it's been allocated. Attributes, methods and events are a way of programmers interacting and customizing that component a particular way, in the way that the component's exposed. So broadly speaking, this is what Lightning components are all about. Like Salesforce are very much pushing us to think more about a component-driven architecture and the way that we distribute our applications. In a bit more detail, let's talk about events and the way that Lightning components publish and subscribe works. So we have an event. In this case, it's called My App Event, and it's really just out there on its own. It's something that happens. We don't know who generates it. We don't actually know who consumes it. We just know it's possible that it might occur, that event, and it's obvious it's available for people to consume it. The event itself should have more reasonable title than My App Event, and we'll see an example of that shortly. But keeping it in the abstract, component A might register that it actually fires My App Event. That's something that component A would advertise, that it's possible that at any given time it would fire that event at least once. And in firing that event, others could listen to that are completely unrelated to component A. B and C don't know about component A, they simply just know about the event. And this isn't the only eventing model that exists in Lightning. There is a component event model which is more tightly coupled to the components. So you should decide yourself whether you're using the app level event model or the component level event model. In this case, we do want some separation of concerns, so we have chosen to use an app level event going forward in this presentation. So here's the components. I have used SLDS to style these. They're probably not the most elegant of components, but they'll serve as a good purpose to demonstrate what we need for this session. And the general idea is that we're searching for an address. We're looking to see which account matches the criteria I'm typing in the edit field. As I'm doing that, accounts are shown to me that match that criteria and the contacts below. When I click on a contact, that generates an event. And I've chosen inside Lightning Experience to show that event via another component called the address component. And the address component's job is pretty simple. Listen to the event and show the address. That's all it does. And it's true, you could probably put multiple components on the page that do that and see them all update at once. That is kind of another cool demonstration of application events that doesn't have to be a one-to-one publish subscribe scenario. So this provides a good separation of concerns, separation between searching for an address and actually what happens when you found one. In this case, we're showing it on screen. So let's have a quick demo of that and also get a bit of a highlight of the excellent feature in Lightning Experience, which has provided us the ability to put our components on the home page. So I'm already logged into Lightning Experience here, and I can go to Edit Page, which is new for summer 16. You won't have seen that underneath this kind of Lightning cog before. So when I click Edit, it takes me straight into the Lightning App Builder. And if you've used this before, which is possible if you've been building Lightning components, you'll have used it when it had said phone or tablet up here, because you can create pages that exist in Salesforce or mobile to surface your component. That's been available for a while now. But now that we can see a desktop UI, this is really a bit of a game changer. We can start suddenly taking our components, which are either available from Salesforce, custom ones we've created, or even ones from managed packages such as Financial Force or other App Exchange packages. So let's take our address component and we'll put that here. And we also want our address finder component. And it's worth pointing out actually that I've done nothing to follow the design guidelines here for these components. You should give your own icon and you should give a proper label and things for it. Over here you can also define component properties that people design and customize the component's behavior inside the designer, which is also a pretty cool feature. So we've added our two components. Let's save the page, the layout, go back, and we should find those components are now showing in the UI. So I can start using those and you can get an idea of the functionality of the component. You can see as I'm typing it's filtering. So I'm going to go ahead and pick gas, United Oil, gas UK, and I can see that it is updating the contacts as I'm changing the accounts. In this case I want to pick Stella, and I can see an address has appeared in my address component. So this is an example of the app level event firing and being received by the component on the fly, and everything's working as expected dynamically. Now I could go ahead and just copy paste that just using regular copy paste techniques in the browser, and I can go into my Google Doc and I can paste that in and I start writing whatever correspondence it is that I'm needing to write. But that's not a pretty good user experience. I think we can definitely improve on that with Lightning Out. So let's get back into the deck before we take a further look at how we can improve that. And take a look at briefly what enables us to get to this point. So there is a really good section actually in the documentation that takes you through the broader steps of enabling your Lightning components to work in App Builder and Pages, just as I've shown you here. The key elements to it are implementing some interfaces. They are kind of what I would call tag interfaces in that you don't need to do anything, implement any methods. They're just there to let Salesforce container Lightning experience know that you've designed them for working in flexi pages, and that they are hostable components. They do need to be global. You can see that the access level is global, and we'll get on to a bit more about that later in the deck. So as I said, you can assign icons and things like that, so they get a better user experience, better look and feel inside the designer for your component. So lining out, let's get to what we're really here to talk about, is available in any platform. Obviously, any is kind of broad term, so we'll talk about what some of the requirements are to make it a hospitable environment for a Lightning component shortly. SharePoint, Heroku, Node, Angular, Office 365, SAP are all environments that if you search on the internet, you'll find Salesforce have been talking about at Dreamforce and other blogs and articles showing how Lightning Out works in these environments. Lightning Out requirements are as follows. You need to be making your components global. That's a requirement, as I said earlier, for making them in Lightning, visible in Lightning Experience anyway. If you want developers to use your components, then just like an Apex API, you will need to make them global. And this helps going forward, making sure that you don't break any kind of contract with either Lightning App Builder or any developers by changing things that they're previously dependent on in prior releases of your component. You do need to create something called a Lightning dependency app. So if you have been doing Lightning development, like component development, you might have created an app to quickly host or build something that you want to package and show your components as a sort of pre-built arrangement. This type of app is non-visual. It's there to assist with the kind of plumbing of Lightning Out. We'll go into a bit more detail like that. It only includes top-level components you want to use. So if you actually have many components that are used in a sort of hierarchical arrangement, you have a large component that consists of smaller components, you really only need the top-level component for this dependency app. You also need to support the script tag. Whatever environment you're wanting to bring Lightning components into needs to allow you to inject the script tag, because there's a JavaScript library called lightning.out.js that Salesforce provide for this purpose, to bring Lightning components into another environment. So that's really important. Another important thing to realize when you're getting into it is you'll probably be looking for how you log in and how authentication works. Well, it doesn't. Lightning Out very clearly steers itself away from that. It's assuming that you have the session ID to provide to it, which is fine if you're on a Visualforce page, or you can implement OAuth. OAuth is getting a lot easier to implement these days than it was in the past. It was always quite a tricky API sometimes to get your head around, with all the different flows and interactions between the host page and the target system. Thankfully, there's a lot more library support for that, and I did find some library support for that in Google App Script, which we'll see. I've linked to later in the deck. So hopefully save you guys a bit of legwork hunting around for that solution in Google. So let's have a look now more about how it works in Google Apps, and to do that we'll have a little demo. And as a real brief teaser before the demo, essentially what Google Apps allows us to do, and it's not just Google Docs, it's inside their forms and presentation and form builder. There's a script editor. And the script editor is under the Tools menu, and it should be available to anybody. As far as I'm aware, it's not restricted to just developers. You should see that in any Google Doc UI. Once you do that, it will bring up a code editor, and it uses Google App Script is in fact JavaScript, probably not too unsurprisingly. And essentially, in this particular case, we have a single JavaScript file and a single HTML file, which drive the basic sort of plumbing to get things going. And once you've done the requisite coding, and there's some good samples which I'll link to, you'll get yourself a menu, in this case the Lightning Out demo, and a sub-menu where we can get things going. And Google App Add-ons are available as kind of marketplace as well, so you can do get add-ons that's shown on the screen here, and it'll show sort of those that have been published in a sort of Google App Add-on marketplace, and that's in fact where the lucid chart diagram add-on came from this screenshot. So let's have a demo, and then we'll get into some more detail on exactly again how that was put together. So let's revisit the document that I pasted into earlier and see if we can improve on that user experience. I'm going to start the Lightning Out demo here, click Start, and that immediately pops up a sidebar here, and lo and behold, it has got the component that we were just using inside Lightning Experience, and it's even using the Salesforce Lightning design system, so look and feel looks quite familiar as well. It's not just unstyled HTML. Now when I'm clicking, you can see that it's actually, and it's pretty crude coding at the moment, it's really just sort of an example. Obviously you might want to be changing the address as it's entering in, but you can see, I'll clear that back and do this again, as I'm clicking on the contact rather, it is just dumping those direct in there. So the arrangement here is that the event that's being generated by the address finder is not being displayed on the screen using the address component. That's actually not involved in this picture. It's being handled by some Google App script, and the event is actually ending up in the document rather than being displayed on the screen as it was in Lightning Experience. So that's a really good example of separation of concerns in terms of components, and the way that sometimes it might not be amazingly obvious to you as to how to break up your components, but sometimes thinking about that ahead can give you more agility in terms of the way that you use your components, not only just in Salesforce UIs in different contexts, but how you use your components perhaps outside of Salesforce. So let's continue through the rest of the deck and drill into a little bit more detail. So first of all, we had the address finder component that, other than its contained looking slightly different, or quite a lot different than Lightning Experience, it itself was pretty much the same as we found it the last time. It still output the address info event, which is what happened last time. Only this time we found that the address info event wasn't handled by a visual component, it was handled by some code, some Google Apps script code, which actually injected the selected address into the document. So as I said earlier, making sure that separation of concerns is considered at a component level can really help with some flexibility in the way that you can deploy your Lightning components. So in detail, what just happened? We had, first of all, let's talk about the sort of a broad level. We had two domains involved. We had the Google usercontent.com domain, which is actually the domain where your Google add-ins is served up from in the sidebar, and all of that sort of mechanics happens. And then we have the Salesforce domain, and we've created a My domain, and that's resulted in this URL. So that's the Salesforce server, it's Salesforce Cloud. We've got the components over here, and we've got Google App Add-ins over here. So as we said earlier, the first thing you need to do is find a way to inject that lightning.out.js, and I've deliberately, for the purposes of this slide, truncated the full URL. We'll see that shortly. It does need to be an absolute URL to reference that JS file. Don't copy it or embed it directly. You need to be using the one served up from the Salesforce servers. The second thing is to use this method, the use method, $lightning.use, and that takes view parameters. It's pretty well documented in the Salesforce docs. The key aspects to this, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on this shortly, is that you give it the name of your app, which is your dependency app, and you also give it the name of the component that you want to load. In this case, the dependency app's exposed to components, but not the child. And I've chosen in this sample code to load component A. My container pertains to the div, in this case the container. Well, the whole page, I suppose conceptually, is the container, but really this is the place where we're going to load that div. So the container, it being the page, is loading the component using $lightning.use, and it's appearing in that area. So when you execute that piece of code, when the browser rather executes that piece of code, we can see that the container gets populated with the component, and loading up the component requires CORS, and CORS is required because of the cross-domain scenario, and cross-domain is normally blocked between the browsers, and because they're normally blocked between the browsers, you have to use CORS, and CORS allows the security to occur between the two domains. So have a quick look at what that is shortly. The component itself is then loaded directly into the DOM. It's a full first-class citizen of the DOM and is allowed to be part of that container and that page. And that allows you to wire up other things and interact with the component as well through other JavaScript, just as if it was a component on a Lightning page or a Visualforce page. So CORS is a security feature that allows that cross-domain communication to occur, which normally would get blocked by the browser for security reasons. And the only reason that works is you have to go into the org and tell it about that domain that's calling into Salesforce. So that's under the setup menu if you look for CORS. And when a JavaScript request happens from that domain to Salesforce for a get, a post, update, patch, or any basic HTTP operation, Salesforce returns some response header information that gives the browser the confidence to allow that communication to occur. Otherwise, it will block that. So if you're setting up this environment and you've not done that, do check your developer tools and look for this coming back. It's often a bit of a misconception when you're Googling that you need to send this information. You don't. You need to convince your server, the one that you're calling to your target server, to send it back to the browser. That's the thing that you need to make sure happens, and the way you do that with Salesforce is to register your URL. Thankfully we can use wildcards here because the first bit does vary quite a bit. So that's CORS. It's quite a deep technical conversation, but I think it's worth calling out because if you miss that, nothing works basically. So the components themselves, as we said earlier, have to be global. To create your dependency app, then you need to extend the Lightning out app and also use things like Aura dependency and Lightning require. In this case, I'm bringing in my SLDS, and I'm also bringing in my component, my top-level component. Now, when you actually use the event as well, that needs to be global. So basically, anything that you think anybody else is going to interact with needs to be global. Now, you may find that if you forget this at the moment, it works, but that's not going to last long. So Salesforce is working on tightening all of this up and making sure that in the future, if you don't have global, much like with an Apex class, things will not work. So it's very much recommended future-proof your code by using this. Be careful about it, don't get carried away though, don't panic about it, think carefully about what needs to be exposed and what doesn't, but keep in mind it will be enforced in the future. So inside the HTML for this particular sidebar add-on, if you remember in Google I had a sidebar, you can use SLDS, but you have to remind the div that it's using SLDS, so that's a little tweak I needed to do, otherwise the styling didn't work. Everything else inside the component was unchanged. The component was unaware of what was going on. And I did then need to include the lightning.out.js file. And because I'd created a domain, I was able to include that. And that's really important that you do that and don't copy it from another domain or another my domain. That will work, but if it gets out of sync during release upgrades between your solution and another instance that's ahead of the release rollout, things can get out of sync. So try and keep your solution in sync with the instance where your Lightning components reside, is the recommendation from the documentation. So in terms of the code in the sidebar, let's take a deeper look at $lightning.use, as again we're using our dependency app name, and here's a function that's initializing the component. It's loading the component. And this create component method is actually a mirror of the $a.create component method, and it takes the same sort of parameters and initializations if there is anything. In this case, it's also taking create component is taking the name of the ID of the element to host it into. I'm using something called $a event service here. In full disclosure, that is not presently documented, as I came to discover just shortly before presenting this deck. It's something I'll follow up with probably in the blog for this video or at a later date, once Salesforce confirm what the sort of ideal approach is. The best recommendation I've had from Salesforce is a kind of callback approach. There's a link here that talks about how to make that work. So personally, I really hope Salesforce expose something like this, because it means at the moment our component is completely agnostic of any container or requirements, and adding a callback approach really feels like it's kind of eroding that vision, because I'd only be using that callback in the Google scenario. So as things stand, this really needs to be treated with some caution, because it isn't a supported API. It's used in a lot of blogs, but you'll probably find Doug Chasman chasing a lot of the comments on those blogs saying, be aware this isn't documented. Hopefully something like it will get documented soon, I'm being told, but until that point, be careful about that and study the callback approach if you really need to press on with something from a production perspective. So you can see the event is being handled, and when the event is actually being handled, you can get the address element out of the event, and we can then run a bit of Google App Script, which I'll show you later, which actually puts it into the document. So this event would normally have been handled by the Lightning address component. In this case, it's a bit of Google App Script in the page. So the OAuth side of things is somewhat clunky from a user point of view, but does work. So Google App Script doesn't allow for iframes. In fact, Salesforce won't allow for iframes, and it won't allow you to do things that control the page that you open, or the window open command, or anything like that. So you end up sort of displaying the login experience in another tab that the user logs in, and then once that login's complete, they navigate back to your Google document, and then the login from that point is finished with and done with, because obviously the tokens refresh at various intervals. So once the login experience is kind of passed, it kind of does work quite well, in fact, and hopefully Google will perhaps improve on the way that OAuth works in their add-ins framework, but until now there is a Google provided way of doing this, and you can see how I've configured this code to work with Salesforce, which of course supports OAuth in a standard way. Google App Script is actually something that's available in lots of other Google apps as well to explore and understand, and here, as promised, is the piece of code that I used eventually to add that address. So I took the address as a JSON object, I got the active document, its body, and yes, it's a pretty crude piece of code. It definitely could be expanded to be more complex and update an address, say, in the top of your document as the user changes things, but as it happens at the moment, it's just dumping the address that it receives into a new paragraph for each line of the address that's in the event. So that's the full sort of piece of code. I have actually included that code in a gist link, which I'll show later at the end of the deck. Before we sort of finish this presentation, it's worth calling out the fact that actually at the time I presented this originally in London last week, it was Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And it was really something to consider very carefully in these modern times when we're creating rich client UIs with HTML, because a lot of the accessibility tools built to help people understand the UI and hear more about what's on the UI if they're partially sighted was based around HTML in a much simpler form. These days, a simple menu or a drop down or even a button can be much more complex, and in HTML and JavaScript terms, it makes those tools really hard to do their job. So there is a standards body out there that's created something called ARIA, and Salesforce themselves, inside the Lightning design system, you'll see lots of ARIA attributes starting to appear, and it's really worth getting to know these tags, because it'll allow you to make those tools for accessibility much more easy to use with your Lightning components. So do make yourself aware with that technology and what the key elements are of it. So finally, we can see there's some resources on this slide. I've covered the source code for all of the stuff that we've been talking about here in the GitHub stash. That's where, if you want to follow that, that's where I'll probably make updates as and when I see a better way of doing the eventing model, for example. Lightning Components Developer Guide is really worth a good read from top to bottom. There's some really good stuff in there. It's perhaps not laid out the best way sometimes that you might find it to navigate through, but eventually, if you sort of keep reading through it, you'll come across some really good tips and tricks in there. Quick Start for add-ons is also a link I use to get started with building Google add-ins, and it's really sort of 10-15 minute, and you'll be up and running with a basic Hello World add-in. And then there's that OAuth library again that I mentioned. That'll give you some OAuth connectivity, not just to Salesforce, of course, but to other services like Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and all that sort of stuff. So well worth taking a look at that library. Finally, my Twitter handle, as most of you probably know if you found your way to this video, is Andy in the Cloud, and my blog is andyinthecloud.com. So remains to say that just take a look at Trailhead. There is some really great content on there. Salesforce are putting a great deal of effort, and many others, in fact, outside Salesforce, into the content for this. It is a premier place to learn and get badges and get kudos as well. So if you're into all of that, that's a good place to be to learn and get some experience on Lightning. There's a tremendous amount of information on developing Lightning components in Trailhead. Okay, thanks for listening.